The strike came like lightning in a storm nobody saw approaching. Commander Reginald Thornfield didn't pause, didn't warn, didn't offer the courtesy of explanation that military protocol demanded between officers. His clenched fist cut through the climate-controlled air of the Meridian Defense Complex's most secure conference room, connecting with Captain Diana Ashford's jaw with a sound that echoed off the reinforced walls like a judge's gavel sealing a verdict that had never been properly deliberated. She absorbed the blow without crying out, without staggering backward, without even the reflexive blink that most people couldn't suppress when violence exploded in their faces. What Captain Ashford did instead was something infinitely more dangerous than screaming or pleading or any of the reactions Commander Thornfield had witnessed from the other women he'd cornered in similar circumstances over his distinguished career. She smiled. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What Commander Reginald Thornfield didn't understand as his knuckles burned from the impact was that the officer he'd just assaulted for what he termed insubordinate attitude wasn't merely another desk-bound intelligence analyst who'd grown too comfortable challenging his operational decisions. She wasn't some bureaucrat who spent her days shuffling classified paperwork between departments at the sprawling government facility. And she definitely wasn't the type of person who accepted violence quietly, filed complaints through proper channels, and hoped that institutional justice would eventually prevail over personal power. What she was someone who dedicated the previous decade to assignments that didn't appear in any official military database, executing missions that required authorization codes known only to a handful of people whose names were classified at levels above top secret. Before we reveal exactly how this confrontation began and the devastating mistake that Commander Thornfield was about to discover he'd made, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And if stories about justice and accountability resonate with you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what we're about to show you will demonstrate why respect earned through fear isn't respect at all. It's borrowed time with interest that always comes due. By the time Thornfield's two personal security specialists registered the sharp crack of his strike and began moving toward Captain Ashford's position near the mahogany conference table, she had already calculated 17 different ways to neutralize the threat he represented. By the time they completed their second step across the polished marble flooring, she had identified the exact pressure points along his neck that would render him unconscious without causing permanent neurological damage. And by the time their hands moved instinctively toward the service weapons holstered beneath their tailored suit jackets, Commander Reginald Thornfield was already unconscious on the floor of the Meridian Defense Complex's most secure briefing facility. Nobody, not his bodyguards, not the sophisticated surveillance equipment that monitored every government facility of this classification level, not even Thornfield himself, when he eventually regained consciousness, would be able to reconstruct precisely how a decorated military commander with 32 years of unblemished service had ended up sprawled unconscious at the feet of a female captain who stood calmly adjusting her uniform as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. Now, before we walk you through the exact sequence of events that led to this moment and reveal the specific technique Captain Ashford employed to neutralize a man twice her size in under 3 seconds, drop a comment telling us what you think happened to Commander Thornfield when he finally woke up. Smash that like button if you believe some people need to learn the hard way that rank doesn't grant permission to assault subordinates. And hit subscribe, because today's story proves that the most dangerous person in any room is often the one everyone systematically underestimates. The morning had begun like countless others at the Meridian Defense Complex, a state-of-the-art facility carved into the mountainous terrain of northern Colorado, where America's most sensitive intelligence operations were planned behind titanium-reinforced walls and quantum-encrypted communication systems. The complex sprawled across 43 acres of carefully controlled landscape, its glass and steel architecture designed to project both transparency and impenetrable security to the select few who possessed clearance levels sufficient for access to its restricted areas. This wasn't some recruitment center where idealistic young people signed papers chasing dreams of military glory. This was where strategy evolved into action, where decisions materialized that influenced global stability, where individuals whose names never appeared in public records gathered to discuss operations that would never be acknowledged by any government spokesperson. Captain Diana Ashford had received orders to report to Conference Room Alpha 7 for what her assignment brief described as a strategic consultation regarding overseas asset coordination. Standard bureaucratic language that could indicate anything from routine briefing updates to career-ending interrogations, depending entirely on who had requested the meeting and what agenda they intended to pursue. What definitely wasn't standard was the way Commander Thornfield had been observing her since she'd entered the secure facility 25 minutes earlier. Not the professional evaluation of a superior officer assessing a subordinate's competence and reliability. Something predatory that made her situational awareness protocols activate automatically, sharpening her attention to details that might prove tactically relevant if circumstances deteriorated beyond diplomatic resolution. She'd encountered that particular expression before, in places where powerful men assumed their authority extended beyond professional boundaries into personal territory they had no legitimate right to claim. Captain Diana Ashford had learned to navigate institutional power structures with the precision of someone whose survival had once depended on reading social dynamics correctly. At 34, she possessed the kind of professional composure that came from years of operating in environments where a single misinterpreted gesture could escalate into international incidents or personal catastrophes. Her dress uniform displayed the standard ribbons and commendations expected of an officer with her apparent service record, though the most significant achievements of her career would never be represented by visible decorations. The Meridian Defense Complex felt familiar despite this being only her third visit to the facility. Government installations shared architectural DNA regardless of their specific functions. Wide corridors designed to accommodate both foot traffic and equipment transport. Artwork selected by committees prioritizing inoffensive neutrality over aesthetic impact, and the particular atmosphere that resulted from combining advanced security measures with bureaucratic efficiency. Everything calculated to project authority while maintaining the psychological comfort necessary for personnel who made decisions affecting millions of lives. Conference Room Alpha 7 occupied the facility's 7th sublevel, accessible only through biometric scanners and clearance verification systems that logged every entry with timestamp precision. The room itself reflected the complex's commitment to technological sophistication. Holographic display capabilities, quantum-encrypted communication arrays, and environmental controls that could maintain perfect atmospheric conditions regardless of external weather or internal occupancy levels. More importantly for today's meeting, it featured soundproofing specifications that prevented electronic surveillance from unauthorized sources while ensuring complete privacy for discussions requiring absolute discretion. Captain Ashford had arrived precisely on schedule, as military training demanded. Though punctuality felt different when the meeting's purpose remained deliberately vague despite her security clearance providing access to information that most government personnel would never be authorized to review. Her briefing packet contained standard language about strategic consultation and overseas coordination, but the administrative codes attached to her orders suggested involvement of command authorities operating several levels above normal intelligence division hierarchy. The weight of her service weapon provided familiar comfort, though firearms were technically restricted in most conference facilities. Her operational clearance exempted her from standard limitations, a privilege reflecting responsibilities that extended beyond conventional military protocols. Years of experience in situations where being armed represented the difference between mission success and personnel casualties had taught her to appreciate bureaucratic exceptions that prioritized practical security over procedural uniformity. Commander Thornfield's aide had greeted her with professional courtesy that revealed nothing about the meeting's actual agenda. Brief credential verification, confirmation of security protocols, and dismissal with instructions to proceed directly to the conference room where Commander Thornfield was waiting. No coffee offered, no preliminary briefing, no indication whether this represented routine consultation or something requiring more careful preparation. The conference room's atmosphere had shifted perceptibly the moment she entered. Commander Thornfield's attention felt different from the professional assessment she'd expected from a superior officer evaluating subordinate capabilities, something that triggered the hypervigilance protocols developed through years of training that emphasized environmental awareness as fundamental survival skill. His gaze lingered on aspects of her appearance that had no relevance to military competence or operational planning, while his questions demonstrated superficial understanding of the intelligence reports he claimed to be reviewing. Professional instincts honed by extensive experience with authority figures whose motivations didn't always align with their stated objectives suggested that Commander Thornfield's interest in overseas asset coordination was secondary to other considerations entirely. The way he'd positioned himself relative to her chair, the casual dismissal of his aide despite the meeting's classified nature, and the particular tone he adopted when discussing her previous assignments all indicated agenda items not mentioned in official briefing materials. Captain Ashford maintained perfect military bearing while conducting continuous threat assessment that had become automatic during her years of classified operations. Exit routes, potential weapons, communication options, backup protocols, standard considerations for someone whose training emphasized preparation for circumstances that conventional military doctrine preferred not to acknowledge. Most meetings concluded with handshakes and assignment of follow-up tasks. But some meetings required different kinds of preparation, different kinds of readiness. Commander Thornfield represented institutional authority backed by 3 decades of service and connections extending throughout the defense establishment. His recommendations could influence assignment preferences, promotion timelines, and career trajectories in ways that affected officers' entire professional futures. Standard military hierarchy demanded deference to senior leadership regardless of personal opinions about their competence or character. But deference had limits that were defined by law rather than custom, by principle rather than convenience. The conversation had proceeded exactly as Captain Ashford's experience suggested it would, with Commander Thornfield gradually revealing motivations that had nothing to do with strategic consultation or professional evaluation. His understanding of appropriate conduct between military officers differed fundamentally from anything codified in regulations governing relationships between personnel of different ranks. The isolation he'd created, the privacy he'd ensured, the confidence he projected, all indicators of someone who'd successfully employed similar approaches before. Before we continue with exactly how Commander Thornfield's true intentions became impossible to ignore, and reveal the specific moment Captain Ashford realized that conventional military courtesy would prove inadequate for this situation, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. What happens next demonstrates why some people mistake patience for weakness, and why that mistake can prove costly in ways they never anticipated. Commander Reginald Thornfield had constructed his career with the methodical precision of an architect designing a monument intended to last centuries. 32 years of military service had taught him that success at flag officer level required more than tactical competence or strategic vision. It demanded political acumen, social connections, and the sophisticated understanding of how power operated within complex institutional frameworks where written regulations represented only the visible portion of much larger systems governing career advancement and professional survival. His rise through the ranks had followed a trajectory that military leadership theorists would classify as exemplary. Strategic Defense Academy graduation with distinguished honors, early assignments showcasing administrative capabilities that caught attention of senior leadership, calculated positioning within commands offering maximum visibility to decision-makers who controlled promotion boards and assignment preferences. Each advancement had arrived precisely on schedule. Each new responsibility had expanded his sphere of influence. Each commendation had reinforced his reputation as an officer capable of handling increasingly sensitive responsibilities. The Meridian Defense Complex represented the pinnacle of his professional achievements. Command authority over intelligence operations affecting global security, budget oversight for programs whose existence was acknowledged only in classified briefings attended by select congressional committee members, and access to information that shaped policy decisions at the highest levels of government. His office overlooked the complex's central courtyard through windows designed to appear transparent while preventing electronic surveillance from external sources, a metaphor for the careful balance between visibility and secrecy that characterized his entire professional identity. But institutional success at Thornfield's level required capabilities that extended beyond conventional military leadership. The informal networks of influence that determined whose recommendations carried weight in budget discussions, whose assessments influenced strategic planning, and whose support could accelerate or derail careers through administrative mechanisms that operated below the threshold of official notice. These relationships provided early intelligence about personnel changes, policy shifts, and resource allocations that affected his command responsibilities in ways that formal briefings never captured completely. Thornfield had cultivated these networks with the same strategic patience he applied to operational planning. Defense contractors whose technological innovations required military evaluation and procurement support. Congressional staffers whose committee assignments intersected with his areas of expertise. Pentagon civilians whose career trajectories paralleled his own advancement through increasingly sensitive positions requiring security clearances that took years to obtain and maintain. The connections had proven invaluable for achieving objectives that might not align perfectly with standard procedures or conventional interpretations of regulatory guidance. A strategically timed recommendation could expedite equipment acquisitions that would otherwise require months of bureaucratic review. Informal consultation could identify personnel whose skills matched specific operational requirements before those requirements became widely known through official channels. Discreet influence could ensure that capable officers received assignments matching their potential, rather than being lost in administrative systems that prioritized procedural compliance over talent optimization. This dual nature of military authority had shaped Thornfield's understanding of leadership as something more nuanced than simple command hierarchy. Official regulations established baseline expectations for professional conduct and operational procedures. But effective leadership required recognizing when creative interpretation of standard policies could achieve superior results, when flexibility in application of written guidance could produce outcomes that served institutional interests more effectively than rigid adherence to bureaucratic protocols. The philosophy had application beyond administrative matters. Personnel management involved understanding individual motivations, recognizing what inspired exceptional performance, and identifying factors that influenced loyalty and commitment in ways that extended beyond simple obedience to direct orders. Some officers responded to professional challenges and advancement opportunities. Others required more personal approaches that acknowledged their complete human complexity rather than treating them as interchangeable components in organizational machinery. Female officers presented particularly interesting leadership challenges that required sensitivity to dynamics not adequately addressed in standard management training. The military's evolving policies regarding gender integration had created opportunities for mentorship relationships that could benefit both senior leaders and junior personnel seeking guidance through career decisions that previous generations of military women had never faced. These relationships required careful navigation of professional boundaries, but they offered possibilities for mutual benefit that enhanced unit effectiveness while supporting individual development. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Brennan had represented Thornfield's first serious exploration of how professional mentorship might evolve into arrangements offering advantages that extended beyond conventional command relationships. Her expertise in cybersecurity operations had made her valuable to his intelligence division, while her relative inexperience with high-level political considerations had created opportunities for guidance that she'd initially appreciated. The relationship had developed gradually, with professional consultation evolving into personal conversations that acknowledged her complete professional and personal circumstances. Brennan had required patient cultivation over several months before understanding that cooperation offered benefits while resistance carried costs that could affect her career progression in ways that extended beyond immediate assignment preferences. Her eventual acceptance of expanded relationship dynamics had provided Thornfield with companionship that satisfied needs not addressed through conventional command relationships, while offering Brennan access to opportunities that would have remained closed through standard personnel channels. The arrangement had continued successfully until Brennan's request for transfer to different command responsibilities. Thornfield had approved her reassignment graciously, their mutual understanding ensuring discretion that protected both their professional reputations while demonstrating the possibility for beneficial relationships that operated according to principles more sophisticated than simple military hierarchy. Major Jennifer Walsh had required different approaches that reflected her stronger financial position and more extensive family support systems. Her motivation came from professional ambition rather than economic necessity, requiring Thornfield to emphasize career advancement opportunities that his influence could provide rather than focusing on security concerns that had proven effective with Brennan. Walsh had recognized the transactional nature of their relationship from earlier stages, accepting his attention with pragmatic understanding rather than the emotional complexity that had characterized Brennan's initial resistance. These experiences had educated Thornfield about effective strategies for developing relationships that operated outside conventional military protocols, while providing mutual benefits that enhanced both personal satisfaction and professional effectiveness. The importance of selecting individuals whose personal circumstances created receptivity to unconventional arrangements. The necessity of maintaining official appearances that provided protective cover for activities that might be misunderstood by personnel lacking appreciation for the complexities of senior leadership responsibilities. Captain Diana Ashford had appeared to fit established patterns when Thornfield first reviewed her personnel documentation. Recent divorce creating financial pressures that his influence could help address. Overseas assignments indicating adaptability and discretion necessary for maintaining confidential relationships. Intelligence background suggesting understanding of compartmentalized information that wouldn't be discussed through inappropriate channels. More significantly, Ashford's file contained classification gaps indicating involvement with operations requiring special handling procedures. Officers with that background understood better than most that certain activities required maintaining secrets that could damage careers if revealed improperly, that some situations involved considerations extending beyond standard regulatory guidance, that effective leadership sometimes required approaches not covered in conventional training curricula. The morning briefing schedule had been carefully orchestrated to ensure maximum privacy for what Commander Thornfield had designated as a strategic consultation requiring absolute discretion. The administrative language provided perfect cover for a meeting whose actual objectives differed significantly from anything documented in official appointment logs or departmental scheduling systems. Captain Ashford's orders had been deliberately vague, standard bureaucratic phrasing that could justify extended discussion without specifying topics that might raise uncomfortable questions from oversight personnel. Conference Room Alpha 7 had been reserved for a full 3-hour block, unusual duration for routine intelligence briefings that typically concluded within 90 minutes. The extended time frame created opportunities for comprehensive discussion of sensitive matters requiring careful exploration rather than hurried consultation constrained by rigid scheduling requirements. Thornfield had personally verified that adjacent conference facilities remained unoccupied during their scheduled meeting, ensuring acoustic isolation that would prevent inadvertent monitoring by personnel whose clearance levels didn't authorize access to certain categories of classified information. The room's sophisticated surveillance systems had been discreetly disabled using command codes available only to officers with Thornfield's security classification. Standard procedure for discussions involving compartmentalized intelligence that required protection from electronic monitoring systems not specifically authorized for particular operational categories. The disabled equipment would automatically resume normal function after preset intervals, leaving no permanent record of the temporary suspension that might attract attention from security personnel conducting routine system audits. Captain Ashford had arrived precisely on schedule, her uniform displaying the crisp professionalism that characterized officers whose careers depended on maintaining flawless attention to military protocol and appearance standards. Her service ribbons reflected commendable but unremarkable achievement patterns, the kind of steady progression through intelligence assignments that indicated competence without suggesting involvement in operations requiring special recognition or unusual security considerations. Thornfield had begun their conversation with routine discussion of her recent assignment reports, maintaining professional tone while evaluating her responses for indicators that would guide his approach toward more personal territory. Her manner suggested confidence appropriate for an officer with her experience level, though he detected subtle signs of wariness that indicated she possessed situational awareness capabilities extending beyond standard military training. Not necessarily problematic, but worth monitoring as their discussion progressed toward topics requiring more delicate handling. The transition from professional consultation to personal evaluation had been managed gradually, with Thornfield introducing questions about her operational judgment that allowed him to assess her psychological profile while maintaining plausible connection to legitimate performance review procedures. Her responses demonstrated analytical thinking and professional competence, though her body language suggested increasing discomfort with the direction their conversation was taking. Her personnel file had indicated recent divorce proceedings that created financial pressures potentially affecting her decision-making regarding career opportunities and assignment preferences. Standard background information that provided insight into personal circumstances that might influence her receptivity to arrangements offering benefits beyond conventional promotion pathways. Thornfield had mentioned these factors casually, observing her reactions while establishing his awareness of her complete personal situation rather than limiting discussion to purely professional considerations. The room's isolation became more apparent as their conversation continued, with Thornfield gradually positioning himself closer to her chair while maintaining conversational tone that suggested casual professional interaction rather than deliberate intimidation. His movements were calculated to normalize physical proximity while testing her boundaries and comfort levels, standard techniques for establishing the kind of personal dynamic that would facilitate transition to more intimate relationship arrangements. Captain Ashford's responses had been increasingly direct, suggesting either naivety about the direction their meeting was taking or confidence in her ability to manage situations that extended beyond conventional professional interaction. Her military bearing remained perfect, though Thornfield noticed subtle changes in her posture that indicated heightened awareness of her physical environment and his positioning relative to potential exit routes. When he'd suggested that her recent performance evaluations revealed attitude problems requiring correction through additional mentorship and guidance, her response had been surprisingly blunt. Rather than the diplomatic acknowledgement he'd expected from an officer whose career advancement depended on his recommendations, she'd questioned his assessment directly and suggested that perhaps his evaluation criteria needed recalibration rather than her professional approach requiring modification. The insubordination was exactly what Thornfield had been hoping to establish. Not genuine disrespect, but sufficient professional disagreement to justify the kind of corrective action that would create opportunities for more comprehensive discussion of appropriate relationships between senior and junior officers. Her willingness to challenge his judgment provided perfect pretext for escalating their conversation beyond routine performance counseling into territory where different rules applied. He'd stood from behind the conference table with deliberate authority, moving to position himself between Captain Ashford and the room's only exit while explaining that junior officers who couldn't demonstrate proper deference to superior leadership required education about military hierarchy that extended beyond classroom instruction. His voice had adopted the patronizing tone that had proven effective in previous similar situations, conveying disappointment rather than anger while establishing his role as mentor rather than adversary. Captain Ashford had remained seated initially, though her stillness suggested controlled tension rather than submission to his authority. Her hands had folded in her lap with precision that indicated military training, but there was something about her breathing pattern that reminded Thornfield of combat personnel preparing for high-stress operations rather than administrative personnel accepting guidance from senior leadership. When he'd moved close enough that his proximity became deliberately intimidating, her response had been to look directly at him with expression combining professional assessment with something that might have been analytical curiosity. Not the intimidated compliance he'd learned to expect from officers who understood the reality of their career dependence on his approval, but evaluation that made him feel like she was gathering intelligence rather than submitting to authority. The moment had stretched between them with tension that felt different from previous encounters where his combination of rank, authority, and carefully managed isolation had created psychological pressure that facilitated cooperation. Captain Ashford seemed to be conducting her own assessment of the situation, reaching conclusions that didn't align with his expectations about how this meeting would develop. That was when Commander Thornfield realized that perhaps Captain Diana Ashford represented a different category of military officer than his previous experience had prepared him to handle effectively. The psychological atmosphere in Conference Room Alpha 7 had shifted dramatically as Commander Thornfield's true intentions crystallized beyond any possibility of misinterpretation. What had begun as professionally inappropriate behavior had escalated into territory that violated fundamental principles of military conduct and basic human decency. The careful facade of performance counseling and mentorship had dissolved completely, replaced by predatory aggression that made clear his belief that rank provided immunity from consequences and authority granted permission for personal gratification regardless of subordinate consent. Captain Ashford found herself confronting the reality that decades of institutional protection had created a monster who genuinely believed his position placed him above accountability. The systematic isolation he'd arranged, the disabled surveillance equipment, the carefully timed dismissal of witnesses, all evidence of someone who'd refined these tactics through repetition with previous victims who lacked either the capability or evidence necessary to pursue effective resistance through official channels. His hand had moved from her shoulder to her face with deliberate possessiveness, fingers tracing patterns that had nothing to do with military protocol and everything to do with establishing ownership over someone he viewed as property rather than personnel. The contact carried unmistakable sexual intent while demonstrating his confidence that she would accept violation rather than risk career destruction through accusations that would be dismissed as misinterpretation of legitimate professional interaction. The transformation in his demeanor revealed the calculated nature of his approach. Gone was any pretense of professional consultation or performance evaluation. In its place was naked predatory hunger that had been temporarily concealed behind institutional authority but never actually controlled or modified. This wasn't impulsive behavior triggered by momentary loss of judgment. This was systematic exploitation of power differential by someone who'd learned to identify vulnerable targets and create circumstances that minimized their ability to resist effectively. Captain Ashford's military training included extensive education about recognizing and responding to sexual assault situations, though the scenarios typically involved external threats rather than superior officers who used institutional authority to create opportunities for personal gratification. The psychological dynamics were more complex when the aggressor possessed legitimate power over career advancement, assignment preferences, and professional reputation in ways that made resistance seem futile regardless of legal protections theoretically available through official complaint procedures. Standard victim response protocols emphasize documentation, witness identification, and immediate reporting through command channels designed to ensure appropriate investigation and accountability. But those protocols assumed command structures that functioned according to regulations rather than informal networks of influence that protected senior officers while discrediting subordinates who threatened institutional stability through accusations requiring extensive investigation and potential public exposure. Thornfield's confidence stemmed from his understanding of these systemic limitations. Previous complaints against flag officers had been resolved through administrative measures that prioritized damage control over justice, with accusers typically receiving transfers to less desirable assignments while subjects continued their careers with minimal disruption. The informal message was clear. Institutional protection favored those with sufficient rank and connections to weather temporary controversy, while subordinates who pursued accountability through official channels risked professional retaliation that could destroy their military futures. But Captain Ashford's psychological profile differed fundamentally from victims Thornfield had encountered previously. Years of classified operations had taught her to evaluate threats analytically rather than emotionally, to assess capabilities rather than appearances, to prepare contingency responses for situations that conventional training didn't adequately address. Her stillness wasn't paralyzed fear or resigned acceptance. It was tactical assessment conducted with the professional detachment of someone calculating options that extended far beyond standard victim response protocols. The service weapon secured in her shoulder holster represented one category of solution, though lethal force would create complications that might prove more problematic than the threat Thornfield currently represented. Military police would respond within minutes to gunshots in a classified facility, and explaining why she'd killed a decorated commander during a private meeting would require revealing details that might compromise operational security, regardless of justification circumstances provided. More significantly, her years of special operations training had included specific instruction in neutralizing threats without creating casualties that would attract unwanted attention from investigative personnel whose security clearances didn't authorize access to certain categories of classified information. Non-lethal force application techniques designed for situations where eliminating threats was essential but permanent solutions carried unacceptable political or security risks. Thornfield had positioned himself close enough that traditional combat distance calculations became irrelevant. His proximity, intended to maximize psychological intimidation while facilitating physical control, actually created tactical opportunities for someone with her training background. The confined space that he'd chosen to prevent her escape actually prevented his escape if circumstances required immediate neutralization of the threat he represented. His confidence in his physical advantages reflected assumptions about her capabilities that his superficial review of her personnel file hadn't corrected. Military intelligence officers were typically assumed to possess administrative rather than operational skills, desk-bound analysts whose overseas assignments involved liaison duties rather than direct action responsibilities. The classification gaps in her record that had attracted his attention as evidence of discretion actually represented operational experience that included capabilities extending far beyond conventional intelligence analysis. Captain Ashford's specialized training had been conducted at facilities that didn't appear on official military installation maps, by instructors whose names were classified above top secret, using techniques developed for personnel whose survival depended on neutralizing threats efficiently while maintaining plausible deniability about methods employed. The curriculum had emphasized adaptability to circumstances where standard military protocols proved inadequate for mission requirements or personal survival. More importantly, Her instructors had been explicit about threats posed by authority figures who used institutional position to create opportunities for personal gratification. The training had included specific scenarios where sexual predators leveraged rank and isolation to corner subordinates in situations where resistance appeared futile and compliance seemed like the only option that didn't destroy careers or lives. She'd practiced responses to these scenarios until her reactions became instinctive, until she could assess and neutralize sexual predators with the same tactical precision she brought to more conventional threats. But practicing scenarios in controlled environments was different from facing the reality of Commander Thornfield's hand moving possessively across her face while his voice dropped to whispered threats about what would happen if she continued to resist his authority. The adrenaline response was identical to combat situations. Elevated heart rate, heightened awareness, automatic calculation of distances and angles. But the emotional component was more complex than training simulations could replicate, combining professional anger with personal violation in ways that required careful management to maintain tactical effectiveness. That was when Captain Diana Ashford made the decision that would change both their lives permanently. The transformation in Captain Diana Ashford's expression was subtle at first, like ice crystals forming on glass. Gradual changes that accumulated into something fundamentally different from what had existed moments before. The analytical stillness that had characterized her responses throughout Commander Thornfield's escalating aggression shifted into something more dangerous, more deliberate, carrying the particular calm that comes from reaching a decision point where all pretenses become unnecessary. Her smile emerged slowly, not the submission Thornfield had learned to expect from cornered subordinates, nor the desperate bravado of someone trying to mask fear with false confidence. This was something else entirely. The expression of someone who just received confirmation of suspicions they'd hoped would prove incorrect, someone whose professional assessment had been validated in ways that eliminated any remaining doubt about what kind of person they were dealing with. "You know, Commander," she said, her voice carrying conversational tone that seemed wildly inappropriate for someone who'd just been sexually assaulted by a superior officer. "I've encountered men like you before. In places where authority figures believed their position granted them unlimited access to whatever they wanted, wherever they wanted it." Thornfield felt something flicker in his chest. Not quite alarm, but recognition that Captain Ashford's psychological response wasn't following patterns he'd observed in previous similar situations. Other victims had reacted to his escalation with tears, stammered protests, or the kind of desperate negotiation that indicated they understood their powerlessness and were seeking accommodation that might minimize further violation. But Ashford spoke like someone conducting clinical analysis rather than experiencing trauma. Her posture had shifted almost imperceptibly, weight distribution changing in ways that suggested preparation for physical movement rather than passive acceptance of whatever he intended to do next. The change was so subtle that someone without extensive combat training might have missed it entirely, but Thornfield's survival instincts registered something different about her body language that made him question assumptions he'd made about her capabilities and intentions. "The fascinating thing about predators," Ashford continued, tilting her head slightly as if examining a particularly interesting specimen, "is how consistently they underestimate their targets. You see someone who appears vulnerable, recent divorce, financial pressures, career dependence on superior approval, and you assume that vulnerability extends to all aspects of their character and capability." The clinical detachment in her voice was more unsettling than emotional outrage would have been. Thornfield had learned to interpret anger as indication that his targets were losing psychological control, creating opportunities for him to consolidate dominance through patient application of authority and intimidation. But Ashford's analytical calm suggested someone who maintained complete emotional regulation while conducting assessment that reached conclusions he couldn't predict or influence. "What you didn't investigate," she said, her eyes never leaving his face, "was whether my apparent vulnerabilities might be accompanied by capabilities that could make your standard approach problematic." Something cold moved through Thornfield's stomach as he processed implications of her words. The confidence in her tone suggested knowledge he didn't possess, experience that his superficial review of her personnel file hadn't revealed. Military intelligence officers weren't supposed to represent physical threats to flag officers, weren't trained for direct confrontation with superior authority, weren't equipped to resist effectively when institutional power was applied systematically and decisively. But Captain Ashford's demeanor projected the kind of professional competence he'd observed in special operations personnel. Individuals whose training prepared them for situations where standard military protocols proved inadequate and creative problem-solving became essential for survival. Her stillness reminded him of expressions he'd seen on faces of combat veterans who'd learned to evaluate threats with tactical precision rather than emotional reaction. "I'm curious about something, Commander," she said, her tone suggesting genuine intellectual interest rather than fear or defiance. "When you disabled the surveillance equipment for this meeting, did you consider the possibility that electronic monitoring might not be the only form of evidence collection occurring in this room?" The question hit Thornfield like ice water, though he couldn't immediately identify why it felt so threatening. His careful preparation had eliminated institutional oversight that might have documented their conversation or provided witnesses to whatever occurred between them. The disabled cameras and audio recording systems ensured that any subsequent investigation would rely on conflicting testimony rather than objective evidence. Situations that historically favored senior officers over subordinates making accusations that couldn't be verified independently. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But Ashford's phrasing suggested possibilities he hadn't considered, alternative forms of documentation that his security protocols might not have addressed. Her hand moved casually to her uniform pocket, the gesture appearing innocent while potentially accessing equipment that could fundamentally alter the legal and political dynamics of their encounter. "Personal recording devices aren't authorized in classified briefing facilities," Thornfield said, though uncertainty crept into his voice as he realized that someone with Ashford's security clearance might possess authorization for equipment he didn't know about. "Personal recording devices aren't authorized for most personnel," Ashford replied with patience that suggested she was explaining technical details to someone who'd missed obvious considerations. "But certain operational clearances include authorization for evidence collection in situations involving security violations, criminal conduct, or threats to personnel safety, which this situation definitely qualifies as, Commander." The revelation changed everything Thornfield thought he understood about their encounter. His careful preparation hadn't created the isolation and deniability he'd assumed. Instead, he'd potentially provided perfect documentation of criminal behavior that could destroy his career and freedom, regardless of his institutional connections or political influence. Before we reveal exactly what evidence Captain Ashford had been collecting and the specific moment Commander Thornfield realized his predatory confidence had transformed into a trap that could end his career, make sure you've subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happens next demonstrates why some people confuse patience with weakness until they discover that tactical restraint isn't the same as helplessness. Drop a comment telling us if you've ever witnessed someone's overconfidence backfire spectacularly. And smash that like button if you believe that real authority comes from competence and character rather than rank and intimidation. Because what Captain Ashford was about to reveal would prove that some people spend years preparing for moments they hope never to encounter. But when those moments arrive, preparation makes all the difference between justice and victimization. The silence stretched between them as Thornfield processed implications that threatened to completely reverse the power dynamic he'd spent 30 minutes carefully establishing. The device Captain Ashford withdrew from her uniform pocket was deceptively simple in appearance. Matte black ceramic and titanium construction approximately the size of a standard military communications unit, but with indicators suggesting sophisticated recording capabilities that operated according to specifications far beyond conventional audio documentation equipment. The technology represented advancement in evidence collection systems designed specifically for personnel whose operational requirements included gathering intelligence in hostile environments where traditional surveillance methods proved inadequate or impossible. "Military-grade digital recorder," she explained with the clinical precision of someone providing technical briefing to personnel who lacked clearance for complete operational details. "Voice activation, environmental noise filtering, encrypted data storage with quantum authentication protocols. Everything you've said in this room has been documented with legal admissibility standards that exceed requirements for courts-martial proceedings or federal criminal prosecution." Thornfield stared at the device while his mind raced through implications that threatened to demolish every assumption he'd made about their encounter. His meticulous preparation had eliminated institutional monitoring systems, but he'd never considered that Captain Ashford might possess personal equipment authorized for evidence collection in circumstances involving criminal conduct by senior military personnel. The recorder represented documentation that could survive any administrative pressure or political influence he might bring to bear on investigation procedures. "That's impossible," he said. Though even as the words emerged, he recognized that someone with Ashford's security classification would have access to equipment and authorities that his knowledge base didn't encompass. Security protocols prohibit unauthorized recording devices in classified facilities. Electromagnetic shielding would prevent operation of equipment not specifically integrated with facility systems. Unauthorized recording devices are indeed prohibited for standard personnel. Ashford agreed with the patience of someone correcting misconceptions rather than defending accusations. "But my operational clearance includes specific authorization for evidence collection activities in situations involving security violations, criminal conduct, or threats to personnel safety by individuals with access to classified information or facilities." The revelation fundamentally altered every tactical consideration that had guided Thornfield's approach to their meeting. His confidence had been built on assumption that any subsequent investigation would rely on conflicting testimony between a decorated commander and a subordinate officer whose credibility could be questioned through careful application of institutional pressure and character assassination. But objective evidence eliminated ambiguity that had historically protected senior officers from accountability for behavior that couldn't be proven conclusively. More significantly, Ashford continued, her voice maintaining conversational tone while delivering information that systematically destroyed his position, "My current assignment isn't actually intelligence analysis, despite what appears on organizational charts and personnel summaries. That's cover employment designed to provide operational security for activities requiring different kinds of expertise and authorization." Something approaching panic moved through Thornfield's consciousness as he began to understand that Captain Diana Ashford represented a fundamentally different category of military professional than his experience had prepared him to recognize or handle effectively. Intelligence officers weren't supposed to possess capabilities that threatened flag officers, weren't trained for confrontations that extended beyond bureaucratic maneuvering, weren't equipped with technology that could document criminal behavior with legal precision. "For the past 8 years, she said, her expression carrying the clinical interest of someone explaining case study material rather than personal experience, "My assignments have involved situations where standard military protocols prove inadequate for mission requirements. Places where diplomatic solutions aren't available, where institutional authority doesn't exist, where survival depends entirely on being more capable, more prepared, and more ruthless than everyone else trying to kill you." The words carried weight that extended beyond mere description, suggesting experience gained in environments where mistakes weren't career-limiting but fatal, where authority derived from competence rather than rank, where problems were solved through application of skills that conventional military training didn't acknowledge or develop. Thornfield's institutional power meant nothing to someone whose professional life had been spent in contexts where different rules applied. "Those assignments," Ashford continued with matter-of-fact directness that made her words more terrifying than theatrical threats could have been, "required training that isn't available through standard military educational programs. How to neutralize threats efficiently while maintaining operational security. How to extract information from people who've been trained to resist interrogation. How to eliminate problems that can't be resolved through official channels or administrative procedures." Her posture had shifted almost imperceptibly during her explanation, weight distribution and hand positioning changing in ways that suggested readiness for immediate physical action rather than continued conversation. The transformation was so subtle that someone without extensive combat experience might not have recognized it, but Thornfield's survival instincts registered something predatory about her stillness that made him question fundamental assumptions about physical capabilities and tactical preparedness. "More relevantly for our current situation," she said, her voice dropping to conversational whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting could have achieved, "that training included specific instruction about neutralizing threats posed by authority figures who use institutional position to create opportunities for personal gratification. Sexual predators who leverage rank and isolation to corner targets in situations where resistance appears futile and compliance seems like the only option that doesn't destroy careers. The clinical description of his own behavior from someone who'd apparently been trained to recognize and counter exactly the tactics he'd employed created psychological vertigo that left him struggling to process implications that threatened everything he'd believed about power dynamics and institutional protection. Captain Ashford hadn't been trapped by his careful preparation. She'd been conducting an investigation that documented his crimes with precision that would make prosecution straightforward regardless of his connections or political influence. The beautiful thing about evidence collection in cases involving sexual assault by senior military personnel, she continued with conversational tone that contrasted sharply with the devastating nature of her words, is that it eliminates the ambiguity that historically has protected predators through character assassination of their victims. No more conflicting testimony. No more institutional pressure to resolve complaints quietly. Just objective documentation of criminal behavior that speaks for itself. Thornfield felt his carefully constructed authority crumbling as he realized that every word, every gesture, every violation had been recorded with legal precision that could survive any attempt at administrative damage control or political intervention. His reputation, his career, his freedom, all dependent now on the mercy of someone he'd systematically underestimated and victimized. But here's what's truly fascinating about your situation, Commander, Captain Ashford said, her smile widening in ways that suggested professional satisfaction rather than personal vindictiveness. You haven't committed just one crime today. Sexual assault, abuse of authority, creating hostile work environment. All serious offenses that carry significant penalties. But what you're about to do next will determine whether we're discussing military court-martial or federal criminal prosecution, whether you face years in military prison or decades in federal custody. That was when Commander Thornfield realized that Captain Diana Ashford had been several steps ahead of him throughout their entire encounter, and that his next decision would determine whether his life ended with administrative disgrace or complete personal destruction. The desperation in Commander Thornfield's eyes became visible as the full scope of his miscalculation crystallized into undeniable reality. The carefully constructed scenario that had served him successfully in previous encounters had transformed into a legal and professional nightmare that threatened to destroy everything he'd built over 3 decades of military service. Captain Ashford's revelation about her true background and evidence collection capabilities had fundamentally altered power dynamics in ways that made his institutional authority not just irrelevant, but actively harmful to his situation. His initial response was to fall back on familiar patterns of intimidation and institutional pressure that had proven effective against previous victims who lacked both evidence and specialized training necessary to resist effectively. The psychological framework that had served him throughout his career, that rank provided protection, that authority granted immunity, that subordinates would ultimately submit rather than risk professional destruction, remained his primary reference point even as circumstances demonstrated its complete inadequacy for his current situation. "You're making a serious mistake, Captain," he said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had cowed subordinates throughout his career, though uncertainty crept through his attempts to project confidence. "Whatever you think you've recorded, whatever you believe you understand about this situation, you're dealing with consequences that extend far beyond simple military discipline. I have connections throughout the defense establishment, political relationships that reach into congressional oversight committees, professional associations that could destroy your career with a phone call." The threats emerged automatically, reflexive responses developed through years of managing personnel who challenged his authority or questioned his decisions. Standard applications of institutional pressure designed to remind subordinates that resistance carried costs extending beyond immediate circumstances into long-term career implications that could affect their entire professional futures. Thornfield had used similar language successfully against officers who'd raised complaints or expressed concerns about his behavior, creating psychological pressure that typically resulted in withdrawal of accusations and acceptance of arrangements that protected his reputation while silencing potential victims. But Captain Ashford's reaction was to look at him with expression combining professional interest with something that might have been anthropological curiosity, like someone observing behavioral patterns that confirmed theoretical predictions about psychological responses under stress. Her clinical detachment suggested that his threats were being evaluated as data points rather than credible intimidation, information about his character and capabilities rather than effective pressure that might influence her decisions about how to proceed. "Fascinating," she said, her tone carrying the patience of someone documenting case study material rather than responding to personal threats. Even after everything I've explained about evidence collection, operational background, and legal documentation, you're still defaulting to intimidation tactics that worked against victims who lacked the training and resources necessary to resist effectively. Her analysis of his psychological response was delivered with matter-of-fact precision that made clear she'd encountered similar patterns before, that his behavior represented predictable rather than surprising reactions from authority figures whose power had been challenged by personnel they'd fundamentally underestimated. The clinical assessment was more unsettling than emotional outrage would have been, suggesting someone who viewed his threats as confirmation of behavioral profiles rather than credible dangers requiring defensive responses. Thornfield's confidence faltered further as he realized that Captain Ashford possessed not just evidence and specialized training, but psychological preparation that made her immune to intimidation tactics that had proven effective against other targets. Her operational experience apparently included encounters with authority figures who used position and connections to create consequences for personnel who threatened their interests, situations that had taught her to evaluate and counter institutional pressure with tactical precision. Let me explain something about my actual clearance level and operational authorization, she continued, her voice maintaining conversational tone while delivering information that systematically dismantled his position. The assignments I mentioned, the places that don't appear on official maps, the operations requiring special authorization, those weren't conventional intelligence gathering activities. They were direct action missions against targets who threatened national security through abuse of institutional position. The revelation added new dimensions of threat that Thornfield hadn't considered when evaluating potential consequences of his behavior. Military personnel with Captain Ashford's apparent background weren't subject to standard career limitations or political pressures that affected conventional officers whose advancement depended on institutional approval and bureaucratic navigation. Her authorization apparently derived from security considerations that took precedence over normal military hierarchy and administrative procedures. More specifically, she said, her expression taking on the focused intensity of someone explaining technical procedures to personnel who needed complete understanding of operational realities. I've been authorized to investigate and neutralize threats posed by senior military personnel who compromise operational security through criminal behavior or abuse of authority that could be exploited by hostile intelligence services. The words carried implications that extended far beyond personal accountability into national security territory where different rules applied, where protection of classified information and institutional integrity took precedence over individual careers or political considerations. Thornfield's connections and political relationships meant nothing in contexts where operational security requirements authorized measures that civilian oversight committees were never briefed about. Sexual assault by personnel with access to classified information represents exactly the kind of vulnerability that foreign intelligence services seek to exploit. Ashford continued with clinical precision that made her words more terrifying than emotional accusations could have been. Compromised individuals who can be blackmailed or coerced into providing information or access that threatens national security. My authorization includes whatever measures are necessary to eliminate such threats. The casual mention of elimination sent ice through Thornfield's consciousness as he began to understand that Captain Ashford represented far more than evidence collection and criminal prosecution. Her training and authorization apparently included capabilities that extended into territory where problems were solved permanently rather than processed through conventional legal channels that might allow continued security risks to exist. But even as fear replaced confidence, Thornfield's psychological patterns remained locked into familiar responses that had served him throughout his career. The combination of rage and desperation that came from having his authority challenged by someone he'd viewed as powerless began overwhelming rational assessment of his tactical situation. His institutional identity was built on dominance and control, concepts that couldn't coexist with submission to subordinate personnel regardless of their apparent capabilities or evidence. The moment crystallized into a decision point where rational self-preservation conflicted with psychological patterns that demanded violent reassertion of authority even when such action would guarantee his destruction. Captain Ashford seemed to recognize the internal struggle playing out in his expression, her professional training apparently including psychological assessment capabilities that allowed her to predict behavioral responses under extreme stress. "Commander," she said quietly, her voice carrying warning rather than threat, "whatever you're considering right now, I strongly recommend you reconsider, because everything that happens from this point forward will be documented with the same precision as everything that's already occurred, and your next decision will determine whether we're discussing administrative resolution or permanent solutions to security problems. But Commander Reginald Thornfield had already moved beyond rational calculation into territory where institutional authority demanded violent enforcement regardless of consequences. The violence erupted with the explosive suddenness of a storm breaking after hours of atmospheric pressure building toward inevitable release. Commander Thornfield's fist moved through the climate-controlled air of Conference Room Alpha 7 with all the desperate fury of someone whose entire worldview was collapsing around him, driven by 32 years of unchallenged authority and the particular rage that comes from discovering that institutional power provides no protection against someone who operates according to different rules entirely. His punch carried the weight of 3 decades of successful intimidation, the momentum of absolute confidence in physical dominance, and the violence of a predator whose territory had been invaded by something he'd catastrophically failed to understand. The strike was intended to reassert control through brutality, to demonstrate that regardless of Captain Ashford's evidence or training or authorization, he remained capable of inflicting consequences that would remind her of fundamental realities about power and submission in contexts where only strength mattered. But physics operates according to principles that don't recognize military rank, institutional authority, or psychological desperation. And Commander Thornfield had just initiated violent contact with someone whose understanding of combat had been refined through years of training designed to prepare personnel for situations where mistakes weren't career-ending. They were fatal. Captain Diana Ashford's response transformed Thornfield's aggression into a comprehensive lesson in applied biomechanics that would be studied by medical personnel for months afterward. Her movement wasn't the desperate block of someone fighting for survival, nor the lucky deflection of an untrained victim who'd managed to avoid serious injury through fortunate timing. This was surgical precision applied to human anatomy with calculated efficiency that demonstrated years of specialized training in neutralizing threats with minimal effort and maximum effectiveness. Her left hand intercepted Thornfield's wrist mid-swing with timing that indicated she'd been tracking his movement from the moment his shoulders telegraphed his intention to strike. The grip wasn't desperate grabbing but anatomically precise pressure applied to nerve clusters that controlled motor function, rendering his fist harmless while maintaining complete control over his arm's trajectory. The technique compressed specific pressure points that disrupted electrical signals between brain and muscle, creating immediate paralysis that prevented him from completing the attack or withdrawing to attempt alternative approaches. Simultaneously, her right hand executed a palm strike that connected with Thornfield's chin at precisely the angle required to transfer maximum kinetic energy to his brainstem without causing permanent neurological damage. The impact wasn't the wild haymaker of someone fighting desperately for survival, but calculated application of force designed to achieve specific physiological results through understanding of human anatomy that extended far beyond conventional first aid training. The strike sent shock waves through Thornfield's nervous system that disrupted electrical communication between brain and body, creating momentary disconnection that left him conscious but unable to coordinate movement or maintain balance. His legs buckled as his equilibrium centers struggled to process conflicting sensory input from inner ear systems that were reporting impossible spatial relationships. The room tilted sideways in ways that defied his understanding of physics, while his vision blurred as his brain attempted to reconcile disconnect between visual input and vestibular feedback. Captain Ashford maintained control of his captured arm throughout his descent, using his own weight to guide his fall in directions that prevented him from striking furniture or sustaining injuries beyond those she'd calculated as necessary for neutralization. Her movement appeared casual, almost gentle, though every aspect was tactically planned to maintain dominance while preventing the kind of obvious trauma that might complicate subsequent investigation or medical evaluation. But neutralization wasn't complete because Commander Thornfield remained conscious, and conscious threats required additional measures to ensure they couldn't recover and continue hostile action. As his body impacted the polished marble flooring in what appeared to be uncontrolled collapse, Ashford followed him down with fluid precision that positioned her to maintain tactical advantage while preventing any possibility of his regaining offensive capability. Her knee found the pressure point behind his ear with mathematical accuracy, applying exactly the amount of force necessary to compress the carotid artery without causing permanent circulatory damage. The technique was known colloquially as a sleeper hold, though Ashford's training had taught her the clinical terminology and physiological mechanisms that made it effective for rendering subjects unconscious without inflicting lasting harm. Properly applied pressure to the carotid artery reduced blood flow to the brain by approximately 70%, causing unconsciousness within 3 to 7 seconds depending on the subject's physical condition, stress response, and cardiovascular health. The method was preferred for situations requiring temporary neutralization without permanent injury, allowing threats to be eliminated while preserving options for interrogation or legal processing that required living subjects. Thornfield struggled briefly, his hands clawing at her leg with diminishing coordination as oxygen deprivation began affecting his motor control and cognitive function. But his efforts were ineffective against someone who'd been trained to apply restraint techniques against opponents who'd received specific instruction in resistance and escape methods. His movements became increasingly uncoordinated as cerebral hypoxia progressed through predictable stages toward complete unconsciousness. The progression was methodical rather than dramatic, consciousness fading like electronics being powered down rather than the explosive collapse portrayed in entertainment media. Thornfield's resistance weakened gradually as reduced blood flow to his brain eliminated his ability to coordinate muscular response or maintain awareness of his tactical situation. His breathing remained steady throughout the process, cardiovascular function continuing normally while neurological activity dimmed toward temporary suspension. Captain Ashford maintained pressure for exactly 4 seconds after his movements ceased, ensuring complete unconsciousness while avoiding the brain damage that could result from prolonged compression of major blood vessels. When she finally released the hold, Thornfield's breathing continued regularly and his pulse remained strong but slow, his body positioned in recovery posture that would prevent aspiration if he vomited during transition back to consciousness. The entire sequence had required less than 8 seconds from the moment Thornfield began his punch to the moment his unconscious form settled against the conference room's expensive flooring. Ashford stood slowly, automatically adjusting her uniform with the precision that characterized all her movements while conducting rapid assessment of Thornfield's condition and the tactical situation that would develop when he regained awareness. His breathing was regular, his color remained good, and his pulse suggested he would return to consciousness naturally within 5 to 10 minutes with nothing more serious than a headache and comprehensively damaged ego. But Captain Ashford's immediate concern wasn't Thornfield's medical condition. It was the 2 armed bodyguards stationed outside conference room Alpha 7 who would have heard the sound of their principal hitting the floor. Professional security personnel trained to respond to threats against the flag officers they were assigned to protect. Personnel who would interpret sounds of struggle as indication that Commander Thornfield required immediate assistance, regardless of whatever instructions they'd received about maintaining privacy during sensitive discussions. Personnel with weapons and authorization to use them if circumstances suggested their protectee was in danger from hostile action. Captain Ashford moved toward the door with controlled precision while calculating the psychological and tactical challenges of explaining to armed men why their unconscious commander was sprawled on the floor of a supposedly secure briefing room. The conference room door opened with the controlled precision of security personnel who'd been trained to assess threat environments before committing to action that might escalate dangerous situations into lethal confrontations. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez entered first, his hand positioned near his holstered sidearm though not yet drawn, his experienced eyes conducting methodical sweep of the room that identified potential weapons, escape routes, and tactical obstacles before focusing on the unconscious commander sprawled across the polished marble flooring. Behind him, Petty Officer First Class David Kingston maintained position in the doorway, providing overwatch while preventing unauthorized access to what had clearly become a crime scene requiring careful documentation and investigation. Both men possessed extensive experience protecting flag officers in environments ranging from Pentagon briefings to forward operating bases in hostile territory, though neither had encountered circumstances where their protectee was unconscious while a female officer stood calmly beside the door with expression suggesting she was waiting for something rather than fleeing from something. Rodriguez had 24 years of experience reading tactical situations and assessing threat levels based on subtle indicators that revealed more than obvious evidence about what had actually occurred in environments where violence had taken place. Captain Ashford's posture projected professional composure rather than the emotional distress or aggressive stance he might have expected from someone involved in physical confrontation with a flag officer. Her hands remained visible, her breathing appeared controlled, and her expression suggested analytical assessment rather than fear or hostility. "Ma'am, step away from Commander Thornfield and identify yourself," Rodriguez commanded, his voice carrying authority developed through decades of managing security situations where immediate compliance could mean the difference between successful resolution and catastrophic escalation. His assessment of the scene suggested multiple possible explanations. External threat that had neutralized his principal, medical emergency that had caused sudden collapse, or confrontation between the two officers that had resulted in Thornfield's current condition. The absence of blood, obvious trauma, or signs of struggle complicated his evaluation, as did Captain Ashford's demeanor, which projected neither victim psychology nor aggressive behavior patterns. Professional experience suggested that people involved in violent encounters typically displayed emotional responses consistent with either having committed violence or having violence committed against them. Ashford's calm suggested neither category applied, though her positioning and readiness indicated awareness that the situation required careful management. "Senior Chief, I'm Captain Diana Ashford, Military Intelligence Division," she replied, raising her hands in universal gesture of non-threatening intent while providing identification that Rodriguez could verify through standard security protocols. "Commander Thornfield is unconscious but medically stable. He'll regain consciousness within the next few minutes with no permanent injury or neurological damage." Her response carried clinical precision that suggested medical training or extensive experience with unconsciousness resulting from physical trauma, though Rodriguez noted that she'd provided assessment of Thornfield's condition without apparent concern for her own potential culpability in whatever had caused his current state. Military personnel who'd been attacked typically expressed concern about their attackers' welfare only after ensuring their own safety, while individuals who'd committed assault usually attempted to minimize appearance of responsibility rather than offering detailed medical evaluation. Kingston's hand moved closer to his weapon as he processed implications of Captain Ashford's words. "Ma'am, are you saying you rendered Commander Thornfield unconscious?" he asked, though his tone suggested difficulty reconciling the idea of a female captain successfully attacking a male flag officer with what his training had taught him about physical confrontations between personnel of significantly different sizes and apparent combat experience. "I defended myself against Commander Thornfield's sexual assault and battery after documenting his criminal behavior through authorized evidence collection procedures," Ashford replied, her words delivered with matter-of-fact clarity that eliminated ambiguity about her version of events while providing legal framework for interpretation of circumstances. "Everything that occurred in this room has been recorded and will be submitted as evidence in the criminal proceedings that will follow this incident." The revelation fundamentally altered Rodriguez's understanding of the tactical situation he was required to manage. Protection of flag officers from external threats followed straightforward protocols. Identify hostile actors and neutralize them through appropriate application of force while ensuring principals' safety and medical care. But scenarios where flag officers themselves were apparent aggressors, where potential victims had successfully defended themselves, where evidence of criminal conduct might exist, these circumstances required navigation of legal and procedural territory that fell outside standard security training. Rodriguez felt the familiar weight of institutional loyalty conflicting with professional obligations that extended beyond simple protection of individual officers to include support for military justice and legal accountability. His primary responsibility remained ensuring Thornfield's immediate safety and medical care, but that obligation became complicated when the commander's condition apparently resulted from his own criminal behavior rather than external attack requiring defensive response. "Ma'am, I need you to remain in position while we secure Commander Thornfield and request medical evaluation," Rodriguez said, though uncertainty crept into his voice as he attempted to apply standard procedures to circumstances that clearly weren't standard. "Senior Chief Kingston, contact-based security and request immediate response from Naval Criminal Investigative Service, medical evaluation team, and legal counsel for all parties involved." The decision to involve NCIS represented recognition that this situation required investigation by personnel trained to handle crimes involving senior military officers, individuals whose security clearances and investigative experience qualified them to navigate the complex intersection of criminal law, military justice, and national security considerations that characterized cases involving flag officer misconduct. Captain Ashford maintained her position while Kingston initiated communications with base security, though she noted the professional manner in which both bodyguards were handling circumstances that must have been personally and professionally challenging. Their primary loyalty was to Commander Thornfield, but their training included obligations to military justice that took precedence over personal relationships or institutional damage control considerations. Rodriguez knelt beside Thornfield to conduct medical assessment while maintaining visual contact with Captain Ashford, evaluating vital signs that would determine whether emergency medical intervention was required or whether the commander's condition fell within parameters that could be managed through standard first aid procedures until qualified medical personnel arrived. Pulse steady at 68 beats per minute, breathing regular and unlabored, pupils responsive though dilated, skin color normal with good capillary refill, all indicators consistent with someone recovering from controlled unconsciousness rather than serious head trauma or cardiovascular emergency. Rodriguez had observed similar presentations in personnel who'd been subdued through non-lethal force application by military police or special operations personnel, though he'd never encountered situation where flag officer was recipient of such techniques. "Captain," Rodriguez said while maintaining his medical assessment, "I'm required to inform you that this incident will be investigated thoroughly by NCIS personnel who are qualified to determine appropriate charges and legal proceedings. You have the right to legal representation and should consider whether you want to provide additional statements without counsel present." The advice reflected Rodriguez's understanding that regardless of justification circumstances might provide for Captain Ashford's actions, she would face intense scrutiny from investigative personnel whose careers depended on thorough documentation of incidents involving flag officer personnel. Military justice operated according to principles that prioritized institutional protection and procedural correctness, considerations that might not align perfectly with individual justice or victim protection. Commander Thornfield began stirring on the marble floor, consciousness returning as his brain recovered from temporary oxygen deprivation and his neurological systems came back online. His first attempts at movement were uncoordinated, hands reaching automatically toward his head as motor control systems re-established connection with cerebral function, though his breathing remained steady and his color continued to improve. Captain Ashford retrieved the recording device from her uniform pocket, holding it where both security personnel could observe while providing information that would fundamentally alter any subsequent investigation or legal proceedings. "Senior Chief, this device contains complete audio documentation of Commander Thornfield's sexual assault and criminal threats, as well as my defensive response," she said, her tone carrying professional courtesy, while making clear that evidence existed that would survive any attempt at administrative damage control or institutional protection. "I'm prepared to provide this evidence to NCIS investigators along with detailed testimony about the criminal conduct that brought us to this point." The transformation at the Meridian Defense Complex began within hours of Commander Thornfield's arrest, though the immediate changes weren't visible to personnel who hadn't witnessed the confrontation in Conference Room Alpha 7. NCIS investigators had arrived with the methodical efficiency that characterized federal law enforcement responses to crimes involving flag officers, their unmarked vehicles and serious expressions signaling that routine military discipline had escalated into criminal proceedings that would attract attention from Pentagon leadership and congressional oversight committees. Captain Diana Ashford had provided 6 hours of detailed testimony to investigators who recorded every word with digital precision, while constructing case files that would determine whether Commander Thornfield faced court-martial or civilian prosecution. Her recording device had delivered unambiguous evidence of sexual assault, abuse of authority, and criminal threats, offenses that carried sentences measured in decades rather than years, especially when committed by officers whose oaths included specific pledges to protect personnel under their command. The evidence was comprehensive enough that Thornfield's military counsel had recommended immediate plea negotiations rather than trial proceedings that would result in public exposure of details damaging to both institutional reputation and personal legacy. But Captain Ashford's testimony made clear she wasn't interested in quiet resolution that allowed powerful predators to disappear into retirement with benefits intact and reputations preserved through administrative discretion. News of the arrest spread through unofficial channels with the velocity that characterized all significant developments involving senior leadership. Officers who'd served under Thornfield began reviewing their experiences with new perspective, recognizing behavioral patterns they'd previously attributed to demanding leadership rather than predatory opportunism. Female personnel who'd requested transfers from his command found their decisions validated by events that explained instincts they'd struggled to articulate through official complaint procedures. Major Rebecca Chun had been among the first to contact NCIS investigators with information about Thornfield's previous conduct, Her testimony described systematic harassment that had escalated over months until she'd accepted transfer to less desirable assignment, rather than continue enduring behavior that transformed daily duty into psychological endurance trials. The investigators listened with professional attention while building supplementary cases that would ensure Thornfield faced consequences for crimes extending beyond his assault on Captain Ashford. Lieutenant Colonel Maria Santos provided similar testimony about incidents during joint training exercises where Thornfield had leveraged temporary command authority to create opportunities for inappropriate contact disguised as professional interaction. Her detailed recollections of dates, times, and witnesses provided corroborating evidence that established patterns of predatory behavior spanning multiple years and numerous victims whose silence had been purchased through career pressure and institutional intimidation. The psychological impact on base personnel was complex and varied, though most officers expressed relief that someone had finally held Thornfield accountable for behavior that had been whispered about but never officially addressed. Junior female officers reported feeling safer, more confident that institutional protection existed for personnel who reported sexual assault rather than victims being blamed for destroying careers of respected senior leaders through accusations that couldn't be proven conclusively. Captain Ashford returned to duty 3 days after the incident, though her routine assignments now included additional responsibilities that reflected her role as primary witness in criminal proceedings that would likely continue for months. Her presence at the facility carried symbolic weight that extended beyond her individual case. Proof that military justice could function correctly when victims possessed evidence and courage necessary to pursue accountability through proper legal channels. The administrative aftermath proved nearly as complex as the criminal investigation itself. Thornfield's immediate suspension pending trial created leadership vacuum that required emergency appointments and restructured command authority throughout the intelligence division. His previous decisions were subjected to review that identified several instances where personal prejudices had influenced professional evaluations and assignment recommendations in ways that had damaged careers and operational effectiveness. Personnel who'd suffered under Thornfield's leadership found themselves eligible for administrative relief that included corrected fitness reports, reassignment opportunities, and in some cases financial compensation for career damage caused by his abuse of authority. The process was slow and bureaucratic, but it represented institutional acknowledgement that Thornfield's crimes had extended beyond individual assault into systemic corruption of military justice that had protected him while punishing his victims. Captain Ashford's career prospects had changed dramatically, though not in ways she'd anticipated when she first entered conference room Alpha 7. Her successful defense against Thornfield had attracted attention from special operations commands that recruited personnel with demonstrated capability to handle extreme situations under pressure. Multiple assignment offers arrived from units whose work required individuals who could maintain operational security while navigating complex legal and political environments. But Ashford chose to remain at Meridian temporarily, serving as informal mentor to female officers who were learning to recognize and report inappropriate behavior from superiors who believed rank provided immunity from consequences. Her willingness to pursue criminal charges despite personal and professional risks had inspired others to speak about experiences they'd previously kept silent, creating a cultural shift that prioritized victim protection over institutional reputation management. The broader implications extended beyond individual justice to systemic reform that addressed environmental factors that had allowed Thornfield to operate without effective oversight for decades. New reporting procedures eliminated administrative barriers that had previously discouraged victims from filing complaints, while revised investigation protocols ensured that allegations against senior officers received proper attention rather than being buried through informal peer counseling that protected perpetrators. Training programs were implemented that educated personnel about recognizing and responding to sexual harassment before it escalated to assault, while leadership development courses emphasized ethical responsibility and appropriate use of authority in ways that had been overlooked during Thornfield's generation of officer education. The changes represented acknowledgement that military effectiveness required elimination of predatory behavior that undermined unit cohesion and operational security. 6 months later, Captain Ashford sat in the same conference room where she'd neutralized Commander Thornfield, though the space felt fundamentally different. Smaller somehow, less intimidating, just another meeting room where people discussed professional matters without fear that authority would be perverted into opportunity for personal gratification. Her uniform displayed new ribbons reflecting commendations for courage and leadership that had been awarded quietly but meaningfully by commanders who understood that real strength required protection of vulnerable personnel rather than exploitation of power differentials. Commander Thornfield was serving 15 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to multiple felony charges that had eliminated any possibility of parole or early release. His fall from grace had been absolute and irreversible. Career destroyed, reputation demolished, future reduced to whatever dignity might be preserved in an environment where former military officers who'd abused their authority received particular attention from fellow inmates. But Captain Ashford's victory wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about proving that predators could be stopped, that victims could fight back successfully, that institutional power couldn't protect criminals indefinitely if their targets possessed courage and evidence necessary to pursue justice through appropriate channels. The military was changing, slowly but definitively, becoming the professional organization it had always claimed to be but hadn't always managed to achieve. What do you think about institutions that prioritize protection of the powerful over justice for victims? Could you have maintained Captain Ashford's tactical composure when facing someone who thought rank made them untouchable? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story reminded you that real leadership means protecting others rather than exploiting them, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories proving that courage and preparation can overcome even the most entrenched abuse of power. Hit that notification bell because tomorrow we're sharing another story about someone who refused to stay silent when authority figures believed they were above accountability. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.